Hi, my name is Mark Thwaites. I'm a principal technical instructor here with Okta Education Services. And as a supplement to your essentials training that you're taking so far, I want to be able to provide a demonstration on how to configure and implement the LDAP directory agent. So let's go ahead and dive right into the demonstration. So before I actually get into the actual Okta LDAP agent installation, and then going through the actual integration settings and then bringing my identities in and my groups and testing it all out, I do want to kind of talk a little bit about what I have set up for my demo environment. And then I also want to kind of cover some theory so that we have a foundation of knowledge to work from, so that when I refer back to certain terms or concepts, we're all on the same page. So first thing I'll note here is that our documentation has been updated, just recently, so that there's going to be a lot of really good information that you can review regarding your LDAP vendor that you're going to be working with. We support any LDAP version 3 vendor. We will have documentation that'll speak to some vendors that we've fully tested and deployed, but you could set up any LDAP vendor, but you definitely want to make sure that you test it fully for your scenario. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we actually get into the actual integration itself. For my test environments, I do have an Okta org set up in Okta Preview, but you could definitely use any type of Okta org that you have available. And then I have an Active Directory instance. Again, we do have an Active Directory agent that would be specifically built for integrating with AD, but we can also use this as an LDAP vendor that we can also integrate with as well. So let's talk a little bit about theory first. First, the LDAP protocol assumes that there's going to be at least one server providing access to a directory information tree, or DIT. So if I go into my users' computers here, you can see that I have this domain associated, which is where I'm currently on a server that can go ahead and connect to it, or in this case here, it's acting as a domain controller. Now, this LDAP agent doesn't have to be installed in a domain controller. It just has to be on a server that can connect into that directory infrastructure. In addition, this directory information tree contains at least one naming context, which are the base entries for the server, and every other entry is a descendant from one of those naming context entries. So this will make more sense when we get into some of the terminology. So if we look at our Active Directory environment, and this is where we're going to be placing the LDAP agent, the naming context in this case is okta-ice.local. This would be represented as DC equals okta-ice, comma, DC equals local. The DC, which is sometimes confused with domain controller, actually stands for domain component. And this is one of the specifications that is categorized with LDAP. So basically you have 3 different types of specifications. You have DCs, which are your domain components, our OUs, which are directly in a parent-child relationship underneath the DC, and we'll just highlight one of them here, which is an OU for employees, and this is where I'm going to be bringing in my groups and my users into Okta from this DIT. And lastly is going to be the common name. The common name is going to contain the name of the LDAP entry. So for example, if I go into Jennifer Jones is going to be her common name. But if you want to clearly see that, what you can do is you can go into Attribute Editor in Active Directory and go to the distinguished name. And it'll show you that her CN, or common name, is Jennifer Jones. Now, what's this distinguished name? The distinguished name, often referred to as the DN, is the string that uniquely identifies an entry in the DIT. So if we take a look at the distinguished name, we basically can see exactly where she's referenced within this directory. So her common name is Jennifer Jones. She's in the employees OU. She's associated with the domain components of okta-ice.local. And this becomes very important because when we start setting up the LDAP agents, we're going to be using this to be able to possibly search or bind directly to our directory instance. Now, granted, we're not going to go down to the granularity of finding her record for the actual connection to the LDAP infrastructure, but we definitely want to have a record that we can test with, because you're going to see that when we get into the LDAP integration, you actually have to have a successful test of bringing an identity in to be able to find them. And we're going to need to be able to locate exactly where that user is within the directory so that they can be brought in successfully to be able to save the configuration within Okta. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to close out this window. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create myself a service account in this user's OU. Now you can specify where the service account is going to be defined within your DIT, but what's different here between the Active Directory agent is that you could actually create that on the fly during the installation because the agent was specifically built for AD, but because we're going to be using an LDAP agent, which is going to be agnostic to any type of LDAP vendor you're working with, it's not going to be able to give you that option. So you do need to have that service account created ahead of time for the integration itself. All right, so I'm going to right click on here and just go to new, and we'll go to new user. I'm just going to go ahead and call this LDAP service. And we'll go to the login name. We'll just say LDAP service as well. All right, we'll define a password. I'll just keep it simple here. Train me 4321 twice. All right, we'll say that the password is not going to change on next login. They can't change the password, and it'll never expire. And we'll go ahead and click on next. All right, finish. Okay, that takes care of that service account in LDAP. So in this case here, it's just a member of domain users. If we want to be able to, let's say, do provisioning down into the LDAP instance, then you definitely want to look at maybe providing more rights and permissions for this account to be able to do that. But all we're using this account for is to do the initial bind and to be able to allow users to be synced in groups and allow people to authenticate in using DelAuth. So this level of permissions will be perfectly fine. Now let's go over to Okta and create our service account there. So I'm going to go over to my directory and people, which is where I am right now. I'll go to add person. We'll go ahead and just give this person the same name. All right, and then what we'll do is we'll just hard code in the password here where it's not going to expire as trainme4321. All right, now this account here, we'll just refresh the page, is going to need to be a super administrator, so I'll give it that level of permission. So we'll go to security and administrators, and we'll go ahead and add an administrator. We'll search for that LDAP service account, and we'll make it a super admin. This is required just like with the Active Directory agent. It's the same flow for the LDAP agent because what will happen is this is going to be allowing the agent to connect to Okta from this server so that it can execute APIs to be able to do the functions that the LDAP agent is trying to procure within Okta as people are authenticating in or we're bringing objects directly in from that instance. All right, so with that done, now what we can do is we can go ahead and start downloading the software. So this is actually outside of the actual VM, so I need to get back into my VM here where I'm going to install my software, and let me just go ahead and log into that org here. All right, so Okta ICE 798, oktapreview.com. All right, I'll just log in with an account here. Doesn't matter which account that you log in with, it just needs to have the rights and permissions to be able to get to the directory settings. All right, and what I'll do is I'm just going to navigate over to directory integrations, and we'll go ahead and select add LDAP directory. Okay, and you can see there's a topology diagram here showing where your server that you're going to deploy the agent is going to be connecting into LDAP and to Okta. So that's why we purposely created that service account here and here so that we can go ahead and create that trusted relationship through the agent itself. Also, this is important, but delegated auth and just-in-time provisioning will be enabled by default. So with the Active Directory agent installation, you can actually turn these on or off as subcomponents, but with an LDAP integration, they are enabled by default. All right, so let's go ahead and just scroll to the bottom here and click on Setup LDAP, and we'll go ahead and download the agent. This will download into the Downloads folder. And then what we can do is we can basically select the type of installer we want to download. Remember that LDAP supports Windows and Linux distributions. So you're basically selecting the appropriate one for your server. So since we have a Windows environment, we're going to download that exe. Okay, so that's downloaded and ready for us to install. You can see just like the Active Directory agent, it's waiting for the installer to complete. And then once it's able to communicate to Okta, this page will refresh. And then what we'll be able to do is continue on with the installation within the Okta org. And we don't necessarily have to go back into it from this page. We could theoretically get back to it through our browser where we have it connected outside of the VM. We just need to basically get through the process of installing the software first. So let me go ahead and just jump into my folder here, and we'll go ahead and run this application. Okay, so I'm going to click on Next, and we'll click on Next to accept the EULA. And this will be the default location. Now you're going to notice it has a much larger footprint than the agent, but it's still going to be operating in the same kind of capacity. And once this unpacks and installs, it's going to have a different type of interface that we haven't seen before, where it's going to be asking for some specific information. So the first thing we need to define is the LDAP server. So it defines a host with a port number. The host is going to be our server name associated with our domain. So if we come back into our users and our computers, you can see that will be associated with octaice.local. But the port itself is usually going to be port 389, or you're going to be using port 636 for a secured SSL connection. Since we're in a training environment, we're just going to go ahead and use port 389. Ultimately, it'll be your decision on what you're going to be leveraging. But you can see there's an option down here to use SSL and define the actual port for communication. So to be able to pull the host name, there's a couple different ways that this could be done. I'm just going to use my command line prompt and just search for host name. And then it'll give me a return of the actual server name, and then I'll couple this with my domain name. All right, so this is 2012 R2 standard, and then it'll be octaice.local. And then to basically separate it with the port number, we'll use a colon, and then we'll put in 389. So that's just one way to be able to pull that information, but within the directory software, there should be a way to be able to pull that too. You can even download a third-party tool called LDP.exe, which is an open source tool that will actually allow you to query that information directly from your LDAP instance. It is a Windows solution, but there should be comparable products out there that you could use for a Linux environment. Next is going to be my root DN. My root DN is going to be DC equals octaice, comma, DC equal local. All right, so those are my two different domain components. And then it's going to be my binding account. So as we saw over here under my users OU, this is the account that I created for the service integration. So I can just grab the username from this, and it'll be LDAP service at the domain name. So I'll just go ahead and copy the actual username here minus the domain. I'll take that over into my agent, and then inside my agent I'll paste that in, and then I'll add my domain to it, and then I can move to my next step, which is where I'm going to define the password to do the successful bind of the service account with my agent. So the next thing we need to do is need to click on Next. Next is going to serve as our test button. If everything's configured correctly, it'll allow us to move to the next page where we define the proxy settings for an outbound connection to Okta. If the configuration is not set up correctly, it'll come back to this page so we can correct it. So let's click on Next, and it'll go ahead and validate. And here it's successful, so it'll take us to our next step where it's going to go ahead and ask us for our proxy settings. In our training environment, we don't have a proxy, so we don't have to go through a specific proxy to be able to reach our Okta org through port 443, so we can bypass this step. Next, we need to enter in our Okta org. This would be specific to the org where the LDAP agent is going to be associated. So here, what I can do is I can just go back to my org, and the URL will be listed for me to be able to do that integration. All right, so we'll go ahead and grab this, and we'll come back into our agent, and we'll just drop it right in here. And we'll go ahead and click on Next. Now, just like the Active Directory agent, it will do a pop-up, and it'll ask me to log in. Whatever account you're logging in with is going to be bound to the LDAP agent. So that's why we specifically created that service account in Okta for this integration. So let me go ahead and just bind to that account. All All right, I never logged in with this account, so let me go ahead and define my food I least liked as a child for account recovery, and I'll go with pickles. And we'll go ahead and click on next here. It'll bring up the prompt to basically register a new Okta agent that's going to be associated with the Okta agent API. So very similar to the Active Directory agent. So we're going to click on Allow Access. This will take us back into our agent. This will now bring the service online, and then Okta is going to detect that service because it'll be now associated with the API. And from there, we can go ahead and start finalizing our configuration directly within Okta. So we can go ahead and finish this. Now, you don't have to necessarily be on this page to complete the integration. You could theoretically go back to your org, go back to directory integrations, and then it'll show you that it's still pending for that association with your LDAP server. And you can just click on that LDAP integration, and then it'll take you to the page where you start selecting the version or vendor template that you want to go ahead and work with that supports LDAP version 3. Okay, so before I configure the directory mappings, I just want to circle back on two concepts that we saw earlier with the installation, just to bring this all together. First of all, if you go to Security and you go to API, and then you click on the Tokens tab, this is where you're going to see the token that's associated with your agent on the server. And it's going to be tied to that service account in Okta that we created that is a super admin. Now, you will see that this token will expire in a month from now, but as long as this API endpoint is exercised with this service account, then the token will just keep on getting updated. However, if you turn the server off for more than a month, it will break your AD integration because the token will expire. And also, if you come into Okta and let's say deactivate or delete this account, it'll break the integration as well. So that's why we specifically created a service account in Okta for this specific agent integration. The other thing you can look at is if you go back to your server and we go to services, you will see a service on the actual box that is going to be associated with your agent. So if you just search for Okta, you're going to see it in here just like you would with the Active Directory agent. So if you actually open this up and you go to the Logon tab, it's going to be a little bit different than Active Directory's agent because it's not going to be associated with this service account here. Instead, that's going to be integrated directly within the actual agent itself. The other thing I'll mention is that if you do want to make changes, then you can definitely refer to our documentation. So for example, if we go back to our docs here, there's a section in here that talks about reconfiguring the agent, right? So you basically tells you to uninstall and reinstall the actual agent for Windows, but here you can run a script for Linux boxes. And then there's also a configuration file in the actual installation folder that you can modify as well. And this is very similar to what we have with the Active Directory agent as well too. And if required, you'd restart the service after these configurations are done. There is some options here where it says if these configurations can be applied after the installation. So you definitely want to review these different options. And this could also be tied to the account that you're binding to in your directory if that account actually does have to rotate that password. So these are going to be some good references that you want to look at. All right, so let's go back to our directory integration and continue on with our installation. All right, let me go ahead and select LDAP. This will take me back into my configure directory mapping section that I was in earlier. And what I want to do is I want to select my appropriate vendor template that I'm integrating with. So I'm going to select this drop-down menu and select AD LDS. And what will happen is it'll pre-populate the settings for this integration, which are most commonly used. And if you select a different vendor, it'll populate those settings for that specific vendor. Now, if you don't see your vendor here, you could select whichever one you want, but you're going to have to refer to the documentation that is hosted by that vendor to be able to do the integration because it's one that we haven't vetted out. And that also means that you want to definitely test out all the different capabilities that you want to leverage with the LDAP agent because it's one that we actually haven't documented. These ones we have documented, so there should be documentation in our knowledge base that talks about maybe some of the caveats that you need to be aware of when you're deploying one template versus another. All right, so I have ADLS configured as my LDAP version. Now what I can do is I can get into the actual configuration, and I'm going to specifically set up the object identifier and this is defined as an attribute, and the default for ADLS is going to be the distinguished name, and this will vary per vendor that you're working with. But what this allows you to do is connect to those objects directly within your DIT. So if there are changes that happen with those objects, we can ensure that those objects are connected directly to the correct objects within Okta. So what will happen, for example, is let's say a user gets an updated title or they get deactivated, and your LDAP instance is acting as a profile source. Then what will happen is it'll be able to ensure that that update is going to happen for those records within the Okta org. So if you want to change this and maybe use a different attribute for that association, it just needs to be one that is unique and is going to be acting as an immutable ID. All right, so the next is going to be the user section, and then a little bit later on we'll see the group section. This is where you're defining where your users are coming in from. And if you leave this blank, which is the default, that means that any user underneath the root where you've bound directly to that with your agent, those users would be able to be imported in or JITted in using DelAuth because that's enabled by default. So if you want to specify a specific OU that you want to be able to bring those users in, or leave it as the root and then maybe define an LDAP filter to be able to filter in the users that you want into your Okta org, then these are going to be some of the settings you're going to be looking at. And we'll see that filter option coming up here in a second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into my Active Directory environment. We'll go ahead and minimize this window here. Close off our section here for our LDAP service that we integrated with. And what we're going to do is we're going to be integrating specifically with the employees OU for our demonstration. So that means that any one of these users here, we're going to be able to import them or have them JIT in. This setting has nothing to do with groups because that will be managed in a separate configuration. So what we need to do is we basically need to come back into Okta and we need to define the distinguished name for this. So it's going to be OU equals employees. And then our DC is going to equal Okta ICE. And then DC will also equal local. Next is going to be the object class. Now, the object class of a user is what Okta is using to actually perform the query for the users that we're going to import. So for example, this could be identity person, this could be inter-org person, proxy account, proxy user. It's going to be something that's associated with that identity, specifically at a user level so that we can be able to bring them in. So we're actually not going to be using identity person because our object class for our users in our directory is a little bit different. And we'll use that as the definition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into my directory. And what I want to do is I just want to find a record that I can go ahead and use to be able to find that information for that definition. So I'm just going to use Jennifer Jones as our test user to bring this information up. And I'm going to go to the attribute editor within her identity. And if we just search for O for object class, then we'll be able to see that definition. So hers is top person, organizational person, user. And what we'll use is organizational person for that definition. All right, so what I can do now is I can go back to my Okta org, and we basically will remove this definition here, and we'll update it with organizational person. All right, so that takes care of the object class. Next is going to be auxiliary object class or classes. This is an optional field, but if your base query needs a little bit more refinement, then you can actually add in additional classes here, and those could be separated with commas. And then to come full circle, this is your user object filter. So as I mentioned earlier, this is where our users are coming in from. This is how we're able to find them with the query. Now, if you want to specify that only certain users which are in that OU are going to be brought in, then that's where you define an LDAP filter for that. Now, there are lots of different resources out on the web that can show you how to build LDAP queries for that type of refinement. But this is actually not going to work for us because it's basically doing a base query at the actual object class to be different than what our object class is. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and just copy this, and then I'll just update it so it's in alignment. But I'm not going to filter it any more than that. I'm just going to say that when I'm doing a import or people are JITting in, they're going to be coming in from this OU, and this is how I'm doing my query, and there really is no filter that is actually being leveraged. All right, let's go ahead and scroll down here a little bit more so we can see some more settings. All right, next we've got account disabled attribute, account disabled value, and account enabled value. Now these are pretty straightforward. We're saying what is the attribute in that LDAP directory that's associated with the user being disabled. And why that is important is because if our LDAP directory is acting as a profile source and we want to be able to say if the user is disabled there, we want to be able to deactivate them in Okta when we go ahead and do an import or that user tries to JIT in, then we need to know what attribute is being used in the directory so that we can pull that information. So this basically defines what the attribute is and if it's disabled or if it's enabled so we can make that correlation happen. Next is going to be the password attribute and the password expiration attribute. Same concept as the disabled attribute. So what this will tell us is that when the password expires for a user, we can update that state within Okta for their status so that when they enter in their password, they'll be forced to go ahead and change it. And this is going to be written into the LDAP directory because that is the source of truth of where the password is managed. It's not actually governed directly in Okta. So it's in very much alignment as our Active Directory agent. And then if we scroll down here, just before the group section, there's a section in here for extra user attributes. So what this section allows us to do is specify additional extra user attributes that we want to bring in when we're importing those identities or those users are JITting in. Now, here you basically just put in the variable name for the attribute, and then when those users get brought in, that information will come into their profile in Okta. But this is something that we can also do with our profile editor and doing a schema discovery with the API integration. So this was actually in the product before we actually had that type of schema discovery capability. So I'll show you a little bit later on an easier method to do this where you can do more than 4 attributes and have a little bit more flexibility of how you're building that robust profile of information within Okta when those identities get brought in from that source. All right, now the next section here is going to be group, and you're going to see a lot of the group definitions are going to be very similar to the user definitions because here we're just specifying where our groups are coming in from, what is the class, the filter, and attributes that are associated with membership. But let's go ahead and just go through these and populate them so that we can make sure we can bring in those groups as well. All right, so let me go ahead and just define my group search space. So this will be the distinguished name for the container where my groups are going to get pulled in from. So just going back to my VM here, I'm just going to go ahead and use the employees OU just like I did with my users, but this will be used to bring in my groups. So I'll go ahead and just grab that definition up here, and we'll just scroll down and define that within my group criteria there. The class is going to be group. This should work for us, but let's just go ahead and validate that. So we'll go back into our VM, and we'll go into one of our groups. We'll go into this engineering group here. We'll go to attribute editor. We'll search for O for object class, and then we can see that group will work fine for our query. All right, so we'll leave that. And then this is our filter. So if we wanted to adjust this, then we can specify what groups our users are going to be coming from based on this container by leveraging this filter. Next is going to be member attribute and user attribute. Now, we saw attributes defined in the user section before, so this is a correlation to the directory so that we can determine the membership and user definition. Member is going to be specifically for defining which users are going to be a member of the group based on the DN. And then user attribute is a little bit different. This is normally left blank because we're using the member attribute to define membership within the group based on the DN. But the thing is, if you are using POSIX groups as your group object, then you would define that definition here as an attribute. POSIX groups are specifically tied to a Unix type of group membership, and this will not apply to our Active Directory LDS setup. This is also going to be similar to what's going to happen here with role. We're not going to be defining any type of role here, but if you're using a directory that has some type of role definition that needs to be brought in for that association within Okta, then you can define a role object class and also the associated membership attribute. So the last thing we're going to be working with here is the actual validation. The validation is where we're going to take a object, specifically a user, and verify that we can bring them into Okta based off an Okta username format. Okay, so when we take a look at the Okta username format, you can see that we have different options here. We have email address, UID and the domain, UID or UID with configurable suffix. Now, you don't necessarily have to have a UID defined for all your users within your directory if you're not going to be leveraging it. So for example, if we're going to be using the email address, we could just use that as the attribute that we want to use to be able to create our identities within Okta. But if you are going to be using email address, then make sure that the account that you're testing with does have a UID defined, because that's actually going to be used in the query to be able to find the record. From that point going forward, it's not going to be required because it'll be focusing on that specific attribute to be able to create identities in Okta as the users are imported or they're JITted in. But specifically for the test configuration to work, we're going to need to define that. And I can just show you this. If I go to email address and we search for, Jennifer Jones at oktaice.com, not local because that's her UPN, and I do a test configuration here, we're going to see that this is going to fail. It's not going to be able to find it because it's looking for that UID. So to define a UID, all I need to do is I need to go back into my directory. Let's go to the user that I'm testing with. We'll go to her attribute editor. We'll search for U for UID, and we can go ahead and define it here. So I can do Jennifer Jones at oktaice.com. And we'll add that in there, click OK, and then apply it. Now when we go back into our integration and we do our test, we should get a successful message because we're able to find that specific identity, and it's looking for that UID. So what will happen is when these identities are created within Okta, it'll use the email address to be able to create them as we import them or we JIT them directly into Okta. Now, if you want to use a UID as your Okta username format, then you're definitely going to need to make sure that that UID attribute is defined in your directory for all your users, because that's what we're using to be able to create the username. So if it wasn't defined and we're using, let's say, UID at domain, then what would happen is we would have the domain information, but not the UID, because the UID would be blank for the users you're trying to bring in, and then they would fail to actually be staged or activated when those identities are being created within the org. So it would create failure. And you can also just use the UID, so that's just going to be the fully qualified definition for that attribute. Again, the default definition for users in Okta is the email address, so it'd have to be an email address format, or you could do a configurable suffix. And what happens here is you just basically type in the actual suffix, and it'll go ahead and append the UID to that configurable suffix. So you do have some options there. But what we're going to do here is we're just going to go ahead and just use the email address, and we can move on to our next step. Now, this basically completes the LDAP integration. So we can click on the Done button. And now it's going to look very similar to what an Active Directory agent installation would look like, where you have your different agents that are currently connected for high availability. You can see all the different people that are currently associated with your LDAP instance. You do have your provisioning options where you can either do provisioning from Okta into the LDAP instance. It's important to note that when we are pushing, let's say, identities down into the directory, that service account in the directory has the proper permissions to be able to do these operations, such as create, update, deactivate, and synchronize passwords, very similar with Active Directory agent. And then we also have our provisioning from LDAP. So let's just take a look at some of these settings, because most of them are the same as the Active Directory agent, but there are a couple that are different. All right, so let's click on Edit, and we'll go down to our first setting, which is Schedule Import. So this is going to work very similar to the Active Directory agent, where you're basically setting up a polling session that occurs on an incremental basis for us to be able to bring Delta changes in from your LDAP instance into Okta. So this would be the onboarding of new people, the updating of attributes, the updating of, let's say, a lifecycle state change. So for example, if LDAP is our profile source, then if the user gets disabled in LDAP, then we can deactivate them in Okta. And then we'll also bring in, let's say, group membership changes as well. To build on this, you can see that there is incremental import is enabled by default. So this could be turned off. So that means you're scheduling a full import to happen on a regular cadence. And then down here is the decimal precision. You shouldn't really have to change this, but this is the value that we're using to track changes in the directory, and you can select the appropriate value. If you use a different value for your directory, then you can change that decimal point in that reference. Another item here is maximum clock skew. Like a lot of different software solutions, if the timing is out between Okta and your server, then that can cause problems with imports. So this is where you're creating a buffer of the actual timing between both systems if they are out of sync. And then lastly is activation emails. So when you're bringing these identities in with an import, which we're going to be looking at here a little bit later, then what you can do is you can say, I don't want to send them an activation email to have them start logging in because maybe you're using your own communication for that. All right, so we'll cancel this out. Let's move down to the next section here. Nothing different here than what we see with the Active Directory agent. This just specifies what attribute in Okta that we're using to be able to match to that existing record so that we can align accordingly. And it could be the Okta username, email address, maybe a specific attribute or a combination of attributes. This is specifying if there's going to be a partial mismatch that's going to be supported when you're bringing those identities in to match to an existing record. And then you get into your confirmation settings, which allows you to automatically create identities if they don't exist, where you can either stage them or activate them, or match them to an existing record based on this matching criteria above. And then down here, this is some older terminology where it says profile mastery. We're trying to move into the new terms, which is profile sourcing. But this is basically saying that LDAP is our profile source for our identity. So if this is enabled, then if a user becomes deactivated in LDAP, then we will deactivate them in Okta. And you can also turn this on where you could say if they get reactivated, then if they are deactivated in Okta, they could be reactivated as well. And then lastly is going to be the import safeguard setting. And what this really comes down to is when you're doing an import, if a certain threshold is hit above a certain number, so in this case 20%, then that import will be paused, and then your administrators will be notified via email and a task in the actual Okta UI to take action on that pending import. So you either have two options. One, you go into your source of truth and update the status of those accounts where they shouldn't be deactivated and then clear out that import within Okta, or you process the import and then all those users get deactivated. It's just a threshold to be able to protect the state of your users in the case of a whole bunch of people getting deactivated in the source of truth. And then down at the bottom here is all your attribute mappings. And this kind of comes into what I was talking about earlier, where when you're going through the configuration, you can specify certain attributes that you want to bring in. Here, I can actually go into my profile editor, or I can just come up here and we can go to profile editor as well. And I can go to my directory integration, go to my profile here, and you can click on add attributes. And what will happen is this will get picked up by the LDAP agent, and it'll allow us to do a schema discovery against that directory to be able to associate with attributes that are in that source. So for example, we have a custom attribute in our directory called favorite ice cream flavor. So I can go ahead and associate with that attribute. So I don't necessarily have to define that within the settings. I can do a schema discovery for that definition. And then mappings is not going to be any different than what we've seen with any other type of directory integration, such as AD or maybe connecting to an application data store. You want to specify what your direction of communication is. So in this case here, it's going from LDAP into Okta, or you can go the other direction. And what this will do is this will take the attribute data that's coming in from your source and map that into the respective attributes within the Okta profile. And you can also test this out here as well. Now let me go back to my directory integrations here. And the next thing I'm going to do here is we're going to go ahead and take a look at the integration tab. And the integration tab is what we've seen already. And that is where we've done our integration with our LDAP templates. So these are all the settings that we looked at earlier. So if we do need to make modifications, we can, but you will need to validate the configuration before you can save it. All right, now, lastly is going to be the import option. Now, if you want to do an import, this is going to be giving you two options where you can either do a full import or you can do an incremental import, just like you can do with Active Directory. And this is going to basically bring in not only your users, but also your groups from that source of truth. Now, if you have any filters that are defined within your settings, then that will filter those users and groups that are coming in. Now, before I actually do the import, I do want to show you that JIT is enabled by default. And you can see that I have no people currently associated with this LDAP instance. So I'm going to go ahead and log out and log in as Jennifer Jones. And she should be able to do both. She should be able to del auth in, and it'll create her identity on the fly, and she will be bound directly to this LDAP integration. All right, so let me go ahead and sign out, and we'll log in with her identity. All right, so Jennifer Jones at oktaice.com, because that's what we're using for our Okta username format. And then her password is going to be our standard one we use for training, which is going to be trainme4321, and we'll go ahead and click on sign in. So we can see that it created her identity on the fly. We can go ahead and define a forgotten password question for self-service remediation. And we will talk a little bit about the LDAP password policy here at the end of this demonstration. So I'll just say her answer will be beats, and then she'll select an image, and then she'll be able to start using Okta as a service. Okay, so let's just go ahead and take a look at her settings here. And you're going to notice that there is no definition here for the password because we haven't defined that within the password policy. We'll take a look at that in a minute. Over here are her attributes. Remember, she is being sourced from LDAP, so these attributes are not editable except for the secondary email address, which can be used for remediation, such as a password reset or an unlock of an account. And then her security image is shown here and her display language. So what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and sign out. And I'll log back in as my Okta training account. And let's just go to her identity. So we'll just bring her up here. And we're going to be able to see that she's currently being sourced from LDAP. And we'll not only be able to see the groups that she's a member of, which we'll take a look at in a second, but we can also see that all her attributes are coming in from that source, so they're not editable, right? So if we scroll down here, we'll be able to see those attributes. And at the bottom here, these are going to be the attributes that are actually coming in from the source, including that favorite ice cream flavor that we pulled in as a custom attribute with our profile editor. Now, if we go over to our groups, we're going to see those LDAP groups represented. Remember, she just JITted in, so she's only a member of these groups within the employees OU. So we're not going to see other people in these groups until those people JIT in or we do an actual import. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So I'm going to go to directory, go back to directory integrations. I'll go back to my LDAP instance, and we're going to click on the import tab. And I'm going to go ahead and do an import now, and I'll do a full import. So this will bring in every single directory object for all my users and my group membership based on the OU that I've specified, which is in this case employees. So we'll go ahead and do an import. All right. So we have 21 users scanned, so that tells me I have 21 people within that OU that I can bring in. One of them is unchanged, which is Jennifer Jones, and the rest of them are going to be brand new identities that I'm going to have to make a decision on and how I want to have their accounts defined within Okta with a certain status, because they're going to be basically in a limbo state because we haven't got any confirmation settings turned on to automate that flow. We also have the groups that got brought in as well. So I got 7 new groups, and those 2 existing groups that Jennifer Jones was associated with, those have been updated with additional membership. So I'm going to click OK. And just like any type of import you would do in Okta, regardless if it's with an Active Directory agent or let's say you're pulling in these users in through some type of API integration, maybe for like an application, you're going to see the users on the left-hand side and their association with an existing user within Okta, so they can be matched to that user or linked. In this case, none of them exist within Okta, so we're going to create new identities. So I'm going to do this in bulk. So right now I'm only showing 10 records. Let me expand this to 25. And we'll go ahead and select all the records, and we'll do a confirm assignment of 20 records. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and activate all these accounts. If I don't activate them, they would all be staged, which means I can go ahead and stage them, put them into different groups, assign them to security policies, assign them to apps, and then when I want to activate them, I could do that in a bulk capacity later. But I'm just going to go ahead and stage and then activate automatically. So these users will be notified through email that they can start logging in and start using Okta as a service. So what I'll do is I'll confirm that, and it'll go ahead and activate all those accounts. And if I go back to my directory and people, I'll be able to see that change there. So you can see all these records are listed and they're all active. If we take a look at an identity like Joseph Baker, we'll see that he is associated with LDAP as the profile source. And just to kind of parlay off that, if you do want to actually see your sources that are associated with your Okta org, you can go to directory and then go to profile sources. And you're going to see that right now we only have one profile source. So any person that is currently associated with that LDAP directory, they will have their attributes and their life cycle and also their password being sourced from that specific system. Now, granted, what you could do is you could go back to your people here and you could click on maybe Joseph Baker again, and you can disconnect him. And then what would happen is a different profile source would pick up his identity. So in this case, Okta would now become their source. It would not only manage their password, where they'd have to do, let's say, a password reset, but all their attributes would now be defined directly within the Okta org. So the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my groups here so we can see those additional groups that have been populated with members. So if we go back into that engineering group, we'll see all that membership defined. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about passwords. So if we go over to security and we go to authentication, you can see a default LDAP password policy has been defined. And as it stands, there is some complexity defined here. But if we go all the way to the bottom, you can see that currently, regardless of your location, you're not going to be able to change your password, reset your password, or unlock your accounts. That's why when we logged in with Jennifer Jones, she didn't have that option to change a password through Okta to be able to make that change in LDAP. So here you could create a new rule that defines what type of self-service operations those users can do, but it's very important that you update the password policy to match your existing LDAP password policy, because we don't govern it. We basically show it to the user so that they can define a new password that can get pushed down, because the password doesn't change in Okta. It changes in the source of truth, which is LDAP here. Or you can actually create additional password policies for your different LDAP groups, for example. Now, if you do not see this LDAP password policy option in your Okta org, there is an early access feature that you can reach out to support to turn this on, and then you'll be able to define that type of specification. So that's going to wrap up the demonstration here. The final thought I just want to share with you is definitely go into our documentation in our Help Center, and you want to go to this Manage Your LDAP Integration section, and this will give you a good breakdown on how the entire configuration can be set up from start to finish. But I also recommend diving deeper into your specific vendor template that you're working with. We used AD LDS as our test example for a directory, but settings or features may be a little bit different when you're working with different vendors. Thank you for your time.